Thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the British Royal Armouries, continuing my series on the development of the Sten gun. And today, we are looking at the Sten MkIII, which was in fact manufactured by a toy company. This was the Lines Limited company that made a brand of basically little sheet metal stamped children's toys. Now, they had been one of the initial subcontractors for the Singer machine company making parts for the original Sten Mk Is, and they figured, the owner in particular, figured, I bet we can make this. And his motivations were partly purely patriotic, like we can help out with the war effort and make a whole lot of submachine guns, and they were also partly profit-based. Figured, the government needs a whole lot of guns. That is a potentially very lucrative contract if we can get it. So, over the winter of 1941 to 42, the company analyzed the design of the Sten gun and its own manufacturing equipment, which was based on making stamped toys. They were primarily a stamped sheet metal sort of company. They wanted to see, what can we do? Well, they decide that they can, in fact, manufacture an analog to the Sten gun. A Sten gun, really, but manufactured in different ways. January of 1942, they have a potential design. They make some prototypes. There are some problems with them. They have to do a little bit more work. But ultimately, they end up getting a contract in March of 1942 to manufacture no fewer than 500,000 Sten guns, which I think took them rather by surprise. I don't think they were anticipating an order of that many. This is still very early in the Sten gun development phase. Like the Sten Mk Is are still coming off the line. The Mk II has been approved. Mk II was probably in early production at that point, but the government just had this insatiable need for more submachine guns. And if they could come up with another production source, especially from a company that wasn't otherwise already occupied in the defense industry, well, why not? Lines Brothers, essentially what they did is instead of using pre-made steel tube, they used flat sheet steel, rolled it into a tube with a seam on one side, and spot welded the seam together. That became their receiver. Now, this required some other modifications to the design. The removable threaded barrel nut system of the Sten Mk II was not going to be adaptable readily to this system. They were going to have to permanently mount the barrel. But hey, not a problem. They can do that. Lines was able to manufacture the gun completely in-house by themselves, with the exception of barrels and springs, which are kind of real specialty parts, but this led to a quite effectively independent production line. So they got that first order for 500,000 of these guns and got to the point where they were manufacturing 500 guns per working shift. Just an incredible production, and it was before the end of 1942 they had completed that first order for 500,000 of the guns, and they were promptly issued a second contract for another 500,000 of them. Now, before we talk about exactly what ended up happening and, like, was the government going to continue to manufacture two fundamentally different versions of the same gun side by side? Well, let's take a look up close and see exactly what the Mk III was. You might be hard-pressed to believe that a Sten could get even simpler, cheaper, and faster to make than the Mk II, and yet it did. The Mk III was, in fact, faster and simpler. And aside from the construction of the receiver tube, there are a few other changes that were made. First off, to be clear, the magazines remained identical. The internal components, the bolt, the spring retainer, those are all completely identical and interchangeable amongst all different patterns of the Sten. You may remember from the Mk II video that there are two different versions of stocks, and these both were used interchangeably on the Mk III guns. So you have the stamped sheet metal version and you have the tubular flat plate version. Both are perfectly correct to find on Mk III Stens. The receiver cover here was slightly simplified by removing the two screws that held it in place on the Mk II. So it's now just held in place by a tension fit. So if you snap that off, you see we have a very simple stamped piece of sheet metal here, and we have the same, fundamentally same trigger group in there. However, some of the manufacturing techniques here changed. So this one is really actually quite nicely finished, and it's a little hard to see the welds, but one of these side plates is one side and then bent in the front and then welded at one of these seams to the other side. you can see that the trigger guard also forms the back here of the fire control box. On the Sten MkIIs, the trigger guard came up and ended right in here, like so. You can see the difference there. There is a slot in the back of the trigger guard assembly on the MkIIs. For the stock, the MkIII has this hole to accept either the hook from one of the sheet metal stocks or the lug from one of the tubular stocks. That would just set in there and lock in place. So the receiver tube was a flat piece of steel that was rolled around a mandrel, and then it was not actually seam welded at the top here. They actually spot welded it, but it took spot weld every 1/4 inch to be solid and reliable and to not come apart, even with extensive firing. Now, because they're doing that seam, they can just integrate the front sight directly into that top ridge. The rear sight, once again, remains essentially the same. It's just a rear aperture. These 6 rivets here are holding in the rear trunnion for the barrel, and they actually integrated in a hand stop as well. Like, they didn't have to actually add rivets to put in this hand stop. The rivets were already there for the trunnion. They just add a piece of sheet metal on the top, and that'll help prevent soldiers from accidentally covering the ejection port with their hands. We have a series of rivets at the front as well to hold in place the front barrel support there. There were a couple different ways that slings were attached to these. It appears the initial MkIII pattern did not have any way to attach a sling to the front of the gun, and that was retrofitted in a couple of ways. They, at one point in production, they added this plate with a hole right there for a sling. You will also see some examples that have holes cut in the front of that rib for a front sling swivel. That, to me, I would think that that's going to interfere with your sight picture pretty constantly, but that was done. All right, while we're here, I want to take a moment to talk about the proper way to hold and fire a Sten gun, because the British Army was not silent on this question. They had a specific training practice, a specific manual for the Sten that shows you how to shoot it. And the proper way to hold the Sten up front is around the barrel shroud. On the MkIII, we have this convenient hand stop here that will bring your hand back to the appropriate place so you don't accidentally cover the ejection port. But hand goes under the magazine well, and you fire the gun like this. You see a lot of people today trying to figure out, do I hold it like on top of the mag or under the mag, or if I hold the mag, is that going to cause malfunctions? Well, yes, quite potentially. And you're not supposed to hold it by the magazine or the magazine well at all. Even from a low position, and you can see this in the manual, it is held around the magazine, around the barrel shroud down here. Now, you might wonder, well, what if you're left-handed? Holding it out there means your wrist is very close to the ejection port, and you're probably going to be bouncing cases potentially off your wrist. Well, that's a non-issue because there are no left-handed shooters in the British Army. Certainly there weren't in the 1940s. Doesn't matter what hand is your dominant one, you are shooting right-handed. So that is the proper way to shoot a Sten gun. This is wrong, and this is most definitely wrong. And by the way, if we have a MkII with the shorter barrel shroud, well, this is still a long enough barrel shroud to cover your hand. That's, in fact, the entire point of this barrel shroud, is you're going to hold the gun like that, like this. You're going to keep your hands down a little bit to prevent obscuring your sight picture, but you're going to fire the gun like this. Once both the MkII and the MkIII Stens were in mass production, the obvious question arose of which one is better, because at some point the supply of the guns is going to catch up to the military's need, and they're going to want to slow down production. And when that happens, well, which one do we want to slow down? Do we want to keep more MkIIs, or do we want to get more MkIIIs? And after some testing, really the conclusion was the MkII is a better gun. There were always more quality control complaints about the MkIIIs than about the IIs. The MkIII was not a gun that could be repaired as readily as the MkII. If anything happened to the barrel in a MkIII Sten, you basically just throw the whole gun away and start over. You can salvage a few of the parts, the bolt, the stock, some fire control bits, but there's no way to replace a shot-out barrel. If the receiver gets dented to the point that it can't be reused, the whole barrel is also scrap along with it. So production time was in fact very low. Lines got these guns down to 5.5 man-hours per gun to produce, which is very, very efficient and cheap. It's interesting, actually, when Lines was bidding for their contracts to make these guns, it was kind of represented to them that there were other companies that were in a position to make this same stamped Sten, and Lines was in competition and had to present the best bid if they wanted to get that contract. In reality, Lines was the only company that was set up to do this, and there was nobody else. The government never found anybody else to make these versions, and so would have been pretty much whatever Lines offered as a bid would have been accepted. But humorously, they didn't at the time recognize that it was essentially a sole source contract. When it came to actual use of the Stens, there are places where the Mark IIs were better and places where the Mark IIIs. So the two could be taken down and packed much more compactly. It really made more sense for shipping overseas into Europe. Mark IIIs couldn't, more difficult to pack, so it kind of made more sense to keep them on the British Isles at home. So ultimately, when the Mark IIIs started to come off the production line, what essentially happened is all the Thompsons that had been used by the Home Guard, you see pictures of Home Guardsmen very early in the war with Thompsons purchased from the United States. Those Thompsons were highly prized guns, by everybody, essentially. And so they were kind of rounded up and handed off to the commandos, the most elite forces, who basically got first dibs on whatever the best stuff was. The Mark II guns were best for transporting abroad, so they went to the army overseas. The Mark III guns were provided to the Home Guard. So essentially, Home Guard gets rearmed with Mark III Stens, and once that's done, then any further additional Mark IIIs that are available, those can be shipped over to the army in Europe. I don't have exact orders to that effect, but that's essentially what happened once you had all three different submachine guns available. Now, Lines Brothers did in fact get a third contract for 500,000 guns, but that one was canceled before they even got into starting it. And in total, about 874,000 of these were actually manufactured. Late 1943, production is canceled because that is now the point where production has caught up to Army demand. They've decided that the Mark II is the better of the two designs, and so they decide to shut down production of the Mark III Sten. They reduce production on the Mark II a bit, but that's the one they keep in production. Now, this isn't the last version of the Sten. There will be a Cadillac of Sten guns coming next, and that is the Mark V. So stick around if you've enjoyed this. We will have an episode coming up next on the Mark V Sten, which is by far the nicest one. I'd like to give a big thanks to the British Royal Armouries for giving me access to their immense collection of awesome Sten guns to film for you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.